to another episode of What About Design? This is your host, Maria Chernat, and as usual, with me is graphic designer Frank Myong. Thanks for being here with us.
It's always great to be with you.
Okay, so today we are going to go back a little bit to the history of graphic design because last time we discussed the interwar period and what happened during World War II, and we saw a lot of tragic stories of designers who were forced by the Nazi to flee the country, to flee Germany in 1937, as you may recall. The Nazis organized in Berlin an exhibition of degenerate art. This is how they labeled modernism. And as one can easily imagine, a lot of the designers that were prone to accept this as a very interesting thing in design were forced to just flee the country. Now, what happened in the what is called in design mid-century modern, that is the 50s. Now, before going into it, I would like to give just some brief points about what happened in this period from the political point of view. Now, in 1945, a very interesting thing happened because most of the leaders of the world thought that what happened in World War II had to be prevented in some way. And since also the nuclear bomb was so-called invented or was available, they thought about having some sort of international security council that would prevent the tragedies from World War II from ever happening again. Now, if this institution was efficient or not, that remains to be seen and evaluated, but it is important to notice that in 1945, the United Nations was created. What is also very peculiar and interesting is that even though the United Nations had a security component and department, in 1948 in Washington, the United States felt the need to somehow have a parallel institution. So this is how NATO was created. It is basically focused on security and international security. And the goal, both of the United Nations and of NATO, is maintaining peace. Now, there are very controversial things related to the history, especially of this institution, bombing a lot of countries and fighting with bombs to save, peace. Now, another interesting thing, while it is true that the US had an intelligence department, the CIA as we know it today, was officially formed in 1947. These are, I think, very important institutions that had a major impact on what happened, especially in the global north, since the history of design is related to that part of the world, since there it was a capitalist society where you needed a lot of designers to package consumer goods, to sell them. So it was there that this field of design was developed, and this is why I focused on what happened there. Now, of course, as we've seen from the last time, the last episode, and I asked Frank back then what it means to be creative, because I asked him what that means, because I wanted to prove that basically you need a context to be recognized as creative. You need a context. You cannot be creative on your own or alone on an island, or you may be, but your creativity needs a public, isn't it?
Yes, I would say that it's a message. I mean, like general message that is hidden, or not maybe hidden, but you have to relay something with your design because this is the main goal. Otherwise, it will be art. Actually, art is also relaying a message or maybe an emotion. It depends on what is the purpose of the art.
So I want to talk about a main facilitator and enabler of modernism. And I often discuss this institution that I'm going to briefly present right now, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, this is an institution that mainly focused on modernism, and it was an institution that supported a lot of modernist designers and artists. And last time I mentioned Kurt Schwitters that got um, some money from this institution because after the World War II, he was poor, broke, and he wanted to renovate some of the rooms that he previously designed in a very special manner and were destroyed during the war. I also mentioned in a previous lecture Cassandro, the very famous French designer that was hosted by this museum. And they were the ones that basically gave modernism social validation, the social validation that this current needed. What is interesting to note here is that this museum was not opened by the state. It was not a state institution because here in Europe, isn't it, we are accustomed that basically art is the, and facilitating and offering social validation for artists is mainly the task of the governments because most of the museums are formed and sustained by governments, isn't it? Do you
Yes,
have, I don't think we have in Romania a private museum, but I don't know, maybe it's just my ignorance, but most of the museums are state institutions.
of course. I mean, all over Eastern Europe is like that. As far as I know, the states are, like this um, sponsors of artists, of art in general, not private people. Maybe because of the, I don't know, of the socialist ideas behind.
Course of the socialist tradition, that is for sure. But also in countries like Great Britain, I think most of the
Yeah,
museums are being financed and taken care of by and managed by the state. But this was not the case in the United States, especially not with this institution that was created by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, the wife of the famous John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of the initial Rockefeller that owned Standard Oil, the big company that at the beginning of the century owned like 90% of the oil and gas resources in the United States. So you can imagine how rich they were. And initially, even though John D. Rockefeller, especially in the second part of his life, gave a lot to charities, almost $500 million went to charities from the different foundations. He was kind of generous, but in the initial stages of forming of this institution, he was not so prone to help his wife establish it. So she had to rely to different friends to help her, and basically the museum changed this location. But finally, he agreed to give them the land to build this museum on, and they opened up on November 7, 9 days after the Wall Street crash on October 25. Now, we will see that even though they were very impressed with modernism, unfortunately, what happened with modernism on American soil is not very modern. And I will tell you in this lecture why it's not modern. I mean, the form may be modern, but for most of the time, the content and the messages were somehow stripped of their progressive ideals that initiated modernism in the first place. in 1969, I would just point that there was this controversy and the museum was cutting back funding for Ant Baby's poster that was an anti-war poster related to My Lai massacre in South Vietnam in 1968. And even though they initially agreed to sustain and to back up financially this poster, at the last minute they pulled off. And eventually the poster got out and it was one of the most anti-war and efficient in the anti-war effort back then. So I would also mention, just to give an impression of especially what happened in the United States, because not everything was very rosy at that time. And we are used to discuss censorship in our countries, but there was an effort of censorship in the United States. And I think we all know about Joseph McCarthy, or at least I hope we do, because he was a senator, and from 1947 to 1957, he took care of creating the Red Scare and creating this idea that the unions, the artists, the screenplayers, the movie directors who are critical about capitalism were actually Russian spies.
It's, in other words, it's called the witch hunt times, or I don't the witch hunt times, I think, because it was actually I think it was initiated by Edgar Hoover, the
Yes,
the
Edgar Hoover, yes.
yes, and a lot of Hollywood artists, I mean, like directors and actors or screenplayers, were also involved in this madness, because it was madness. You know, you could point, to somebody and say, "A communist, a communist, a communist," and then it was like the U.S. Gestapo, more or less. You know, I could,
Yes, but it was so efficient because now let us remember in 1953, Stalin was dead and the Stalinism was think of
Gestapo. I mean, yeah.
okay, was not over, but the politics of censoring and killing people without a trial and sending them to gulag and so on and so forth was, let's say, an era ended when Stalin died. But that was not very efficient. I would say that while Stalinism was very cruel and brutal, was not very efficient, contrary to what one may think. They were more devious and very efficient in destroying the very idea of social critique, the very idea of criticizing capitalism. I don't know if you agree, but it is my opinion that they were less violent, but more efficient. They didn't kill directly anyone, but they smeared them and they killed them symbolically. And that is more efficient. And it's a sustainable development of anti-communism and a sustainable development of smearing, effects. And this was the time when the unions were crushed also because they were crushed on the basis of them being some sort of collaborators of the Soviet Union.
I want to say one thing only, because there is this case of this Hollywood actress who was called Frances Farmer, and there is a movie from 1982 portraying her by Jessica Lange, and extremely committed to this role. I think she won some kind of a. But this Frances Farmer, the actress, get lobotomized for her beliefs, in the communist ideas. Can you imagine that?
Well, if actually I can, and I think they were devious and very efficient because they were not even, producing evidence, but they were conducting, because I want the students to understand how is this possible. Where they were not saying, you are a communist directly, but they would investigate you, and they will make you come up in front of the Congress and sit in a room full of journalists and ask questions like this: is it true that in
Yeah.
1937 you attended a meeting of the Communist Party? you know and they didn't ask, why were you there? Maybe you like the guy,
Exactly like
and
the
you went there
Inquisition, right?
because you like somebody. That's what's happened to me when I went to some sort of Orthodox priest that was giving lecture. Actually, I didn't have like Jesus Christ in my head,
Mm.
right now. I liked somebody and I went there for that particular reason. And I'm just saying this anecdote just to show how easy it is to frame it in such a way as to destroy somebody just by asking the right question in the right context.
Mm.
you know and this is what happened. I urge the students and I suggest they look at this film, this movie, Good Night and Good Luck. It's actually about the two journalists working at the CBS that finally got rid of Joseph McCarthy, and they got him censored and investigated for the things that he did. What happened in terms of the women movement? Because the posters and advertising played a very important role in creating, maintaining, and enforcing gender roles. What do we see here? The soldiers need our help. Gather around American women. Turns out that you girls are useful after all. So during World War II, they were producing this kind of posters for men to enlist and for women to get jobs, basically. Now, after the men came back, of course, the tone and the tune changed a little bit from this to this. I mean, a lot of the posters were with this woman that was happy, was in her home. She's wearing high heel shoes, has a perfect makeup and hair, and produce like 4 trays of food. I mean,
Mm.
I think I produced this much in a decade. But this is the basic image that was projected. And what is interesting here is that basically in the United States, there was this discussion whether women should be allowed to enter and get a higher education, to enroll in college. You know what the reason was? Can you suspect?
Um, I would say I don't know. Maybe because they were danger for the men. I don't know, like the executive post for men, right? Because at that time, at the beginning of the 50s, right, women get jobs like only like secretaries, or I don't know, like sellers. I mean, in stores, like women who were not married, because when they get married, the jobs, I mean the professional career had to be ended, because this was the overall general good mannered white
Well,
woman.
I would say that not even that was in law. In only in 1955, they managed to get a law saying that companies were no longer allowed to fire women if they got married.
Mhm.
Okay. First of all, now, second of all, it is interesting that they even had talk shows debating this issue whether women should be allowed, to get a higher education. And basically, the argument was, and also at the National Committee for Curriculum, they were discussing this, whether they should teach different things. Women, they should teach women different things like cooking, posture, and sewing. or whether the education should be, gender neutral. And the argument they gave for banning women from entering university was that if they were to enter university alone, then they would get very bored as mothers and wives, and all that knowledge would would work against them in a way, Now, of course, a very interesting movie here, Mona Lisa Smile with Julia Roberts. I don't know if you know him. I often play on the first part for my students because it is so nice about women getting an education. And of course, it's very white, and it is about very extremely privileged women. But what is interesting to see is that back in the 50s, it was kind of hard even for privileged women to get ahead, let alone the people of color were, of course, even were hit harder by this mentality. And what happened, unfortunately, well, it was the second wave, but the women got out of the house, the white women, but their place was taken by women of color, So basically all the care, cleaning around the house was done by women of color. So yeah. Well, also in advertising, what I would like to say here, that revolution, the creativity revolution started. Most of the men, because they were mostly men, like 90% of them were men on Madison Avenue, where most of the advertising companies had their, were located, were white Anglo-Saxon Neo-Protestant, like WASP. They were people coming from the elite of the American society. Now things were about to change when Beall Bernbach, a boy from the Bronx, came along and basically changed everything. He thought that basically he had to revolutionize advertising. He thought that ads were extremely boring. Even when working at the advertising company, he wrote his bosses that the advertising is so boring and they have to try something else. And they didn't listen. So he formed in 1949 one of the most creative agencies of all time. They got most of the awards, I think, at the festivals. Doyle and Bernbach, they were the ones that managed to impose a different way of making advertising that was basically not relying on research. While Young and Rubicon, for instance, hired hundreds of researchers, and they hired the famous George Gallup to manage the research department, these guys said, we don't need that research. We have to rely only on talent. What do you think about that?
Actually, if you remember well, we were talking about the corridor test. Through the corridor, at the end of the corridor, the initial idea will totally, change. So this is something very similar. And, after a focus test, for example, I was working for a bank. I mean, like not directly, but we were creating, advertisement for a bank. And I get, in the process, I overheard, from colleagues who went to this, who were reading the results of this focus, tests. And, they were laughing because one of the women said, oh, I don't like the jacket of this woman who is involved, who is in the commercial, So for her, the most important thing is the jacket of the woman, not what is she saying.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because they were, it is very interesting what happened during that time. In 1953, I think it was, maybe I'm mistaken, it was Ernest Dichter that created the Institutional for Motivational Research. And this is documented in the documentary by Adam Curtis, a BBC journalist, The Century of the Self, a wonderful documentary that I often recommend my students to watch. Now, what was the idea? Ernest Dichter was a psychoanalyst that said, look, if we have a group therapy about trauma, we should have a group therapy about products. And he actually built a room above his garage and invited women to discuss, and he filmed the recording, and the psychoanalysts as well as Ernest Dichter would observe women, and then they would draw conclusions. Now, what is the key ingredient here? Anyone could build, or almost anyone could build a room and get consumers, potential consumers, to discuss. The essential ingredient here is a very well-trained psychoanalyst. You cannot do it by yourself, and you have to be very well trained. Psychoanalysis means like 4 years of college and almost 8 years of therapy and self-psychoanalysis, if I can say it. So you have to be very well trained, because the Betty Crocker was an instant and ready-made cake, and women were not buying it, and they found out with the help of a focus group that women were feeling guilty, and they changed a little bit the prescription, saying you should add an egg, and the sales soared. But you need a very clever guy to figure that out. I mean, it is not enough to get some people into a room and get them to talk and then film them. You need that ingredient, and this is my opinion, that is the psychoanalyst that should, in psychoanalysis, it is called free association. So you basically need somebody that is trained and able to discover these things that are hidden, under the very dull and uninteresting, surface of things. Don't you agree?
There is a whole science, beneath, about that, which is about subliminal messaging, which is about, the overall archetypes. For example, if you see some symbols in the, in the image, you will actually free associate your mind, your consciousness will associate these symbols with something that you know actually in your real life. And but this is an extremely huge science, extremely big philosophy. So I
Yes,
think
this
one lecture
part
is
was
not enough
actually
to
developed
explain
by
it.
one of the disciples of Freud, that was Carl Jung, that basically went along and discovered and wrote books. He wrote a very interesting book, The Psychological Types, that I read, and it is very interesting. And also Symbols of Transformation. And yeah, well, I agree. You see, they were very well versed into culture, into psychology. So you need somebody that is very smart, well educated, and well read in order to give you a useful, not to say, oh, but that woman said that she doesn't like the jacket.
The
This is
jacket,
not
yeah.
irrelevant. And this proves that the psychologist that basically was hired to do this evaluation was not very good.
Mhm. But there is also one important thing that you get to have intuition, because this Bill Bernbach, right? He's the character. I mean, he's the prototype of the character of Mad Men, isn't he?
Yes, it is. I wanted to say
So
that he is one of the guys that mostly he and George Lois were, like the creative fellows um, um, on Madison Avenue. And yes, this is the movie with Don Draper And he is one of the main characters that inspired directors to create this movie, where they depict, this very bold, very brave man that came from Bronx. Also George Lois, that created another important company but was hired initially at Doing and Bernbach. They were the ones that were considered, very brave. And it was, of course, brave to give up this research, that you're saying, and to rely only on your intuition, your talent in order to sell consumer goods. And this is an example, like think small in a country where you had to think big. They said think small, and they hired a designer, a famous one, that launched this campaign in 1959. But, brave also meant very controversial and quite sexist, if I may say so. They started to work for Orbach, a clothing store, creating courage and designs. Now, bring your wife and just a few dollars will give you a new woman. No comment. I mean, and this type of body shaming, it's in, but maybe you shouldn't be in it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they say she's not well dressed because she's too fat for the clothes, If you type on Google, like, advertising from the 50s, you may end up with very, very interesting images, such as this ones. You go to images, because there were mostly images. You see the woman that is this one.
Like Barbie.
Yes,
Like
Barbie,
Barbie.
you have a Barbie, or also you have, look at this one.
Uh-huh.
Glamorizing, domestic violence. And let us remember that domestic violence is still a thing. And look at this one. Show her it's a man's world, and they are promoting ties. Look at this one. I just click advertising from the 50s. Is over sexualized.
Remember Marilyn Monroe.
And, yes, it is quite, troubling to see the extent of it and how rigid the gender roles were, and what kind of messages they were promoting, like this one, this one, this one.
Mm-hmm.
So this was like what advertising and posters look like. And this is basically why I'm saying that, you have here the legend of design also. Paul Rand, I think he's the most famous graphic designer of all times, because he was a good friend with Bill Bernbach. They worked together for years, and he is the one that basically created the designs. I'm going to show you his portfolio in a minute, that created designs for a lot of famous brands. Now, he's promoting here in this particular poster for cosmetic Jacqueline Cochran, like makeup for legs.
Mm-hmm.
You should apply this makeup to your legs. Now, you see how the whole spirit of modernism is somehow, pushed aside when they sell consumer goods. But this may be modernist in form, but the messages are not modern at all. I mean, if you look like this, it's Sharia law for you. Cover yourself. If you want to be able to show your body has to be perfect. So it's a new type of Iron Maiden. You have to be put in this very narrow and very strict role and pattern in order to be able to show yourself in the world. And it is very problematic, this type of body shaming that we have here, this type of obsession with perfection in terms of, figures, this disembodiment of women showing only the legs or only the lips or only, the hands, and over-sexualizing women's body. You have it all here. And even if you think of Marinetti, that I discussed 2 lectures prior to this one, he said that he didn't want to see women portrayed only as this, the happy mother, or as this, the sexual object. So even though he is considered misogynistic, and he is for the most part because he's blaming women for the society and the roles the society imposes on them, he was in fact more progressive in his messages than this type of advertising, and this is the sad part, because while the advertising may be very modern in its form, the messages are not modern at all. This is Paul Rand, and I promised I will show you some of his famous designs. It is basically, I gave a link to his
portfolio.
To his portfolio, and let us look at some of his designs. So he designed the IBM, I think we all know it. He designed it Next. He designed ABC, the logo for the ABC, for AGA, for Airwick, for American Express. I mean, I think all the major brands, a lot of the major brands that we see today were created, and their logos were created by Paul Rand. Atlas, Forum, a lot of them, and he was influenced by Purist Cubism and a lot of currents in painting. His designs were simple. And what we see here, of course, as I told you, is that, as Jeremy Ashley says, on American soil, modernism became mannerism, became only form used to sell consumer goods. It had nothing to do with the ideals of creating a universal visual vocabulary that would bring people closer to art, that would transform the artist and the designer into a person that brings art closer to the people and makes it inclusive and accessible. It had nothing to do with that anymore. We are moving now to a very meticulous designer, one of the most meticulous ones, and it is very interesting that even he and Jan Tschichold, the other designer that we discussed, those who are trained in typography are extremely are paying attention to details and are extremely meticulous. As Jeremy Ashley says, he's one of the most meticulous designers of all times. He printed 2 editions of Manuale Typographicum consisting of 100 pages designed with historical and contemporary quotation and printing in 16 languages. He was what we would say, just as Jan Tschichold was, because he was also using the classical design, but giving it a modern twist, a modern touch. He was also an enlightened traditionalist. He designed fonts like Palatino, who is named after Giambattista Palatino, a master of calligraphy in the 16th century, Melior or Optima. You can check it online because you can look at it and download it if you can find it. And you most certainly will, because they are not very difficult to find. Now,
actually, they are very popular, the Palatino and the Optima. Those 2, I'm using them like,
Now you know who created them and under, who their creator was.
Yes.
Basically, as we discussed last time, a lot of the designers that were trained in the Bauhaus movement and in modernism had to flee the country, had to flee because of the war, and Herbert Matter was one of them. As Bayer, designer that we discussed the previous lecture, who had a prolific and very good career in the United States. Herbert Matter was also very prolific, and he had a career maybe not as a modernist, as I told you, in spirit, in creating, as I told you, a new universal language and transforming art and then transforming society as modernists wanted, but making a lot of money for himself and the companies. So he was born in Switzerland. He studied in Geneva and Paris. He used the technique of photomontage, as we discussed last time about the Hannah Höhe, the famous female designer and among the first ones in the Dadaist movement, female designers, I would say, that used photomontage. When he worked in Paris, it's interesting to note that he was the head of the publishing house that was publishing the famous journal magazine Art and Métier Graphique. In 1936, just one prior to the Nazis' exhibition with the degenerate art, he emigrated to USA. He was hired by another legendary art director that was Alexei Brodovich. And he worked for 20 years with a furniture company, Knoll, bringing them a lot of clients and basically having a very good career, as I told you, not very modernist, but very prolific, not very modernist in spirit, but in style, and also very pragmatic, as I would say. Now, the next one, the next designer. Of course, there are a lot of important designers. I would focus only on the most and famous ones, because there are dozens of designers that were important. And we shall focus on the ones that are also described in the book that I'm using for this course, Jeremy Enschli's one, A Century of Graphic Design. Now, Saul Bass is very important and also a little bit, I would say, controversial from one point of view, because I will explain in a minute why. Well, of course, he worked with important film directors such as Martin Scorsese, Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, and many others. And he created the famous shower scene in Psycho, where a man comes and kills a woman in the shower. I would take aim with this type of glamorizing violence, because I would think that except for Basic Instinct, you don't find movies in the Hollywood, productions where you have women killing men in a glamorized way. But you have dozens of productions when you see this.
Well, did you see? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Did you see the musical Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's all about women.
I think I saw
They're
it.
gonna get it.
Well, let's hope that
message.
sometime soon will happen, because I watched that just like night, a movie that was actually produced in 2021, and it was reproducing the same gender stereotypes and ideas and misogyny, sexism, and violence against women that I thought, this is unbelievable. And of course, they had a gay couple, so they checked that one. They had a man of color, they checked that one, but the message was unbelievably conservative, So I don't know, and I'm not expecting it to happen soon, but he was among the ones that used, this mythology. And I urge students to check out this book, Love, Hate, America's Obsession with Hatred and Violence, where Jody Roy explores this obsession in American movies with portraying violence, and especially violence against women. Now to a more, how should I say, positive figure in graphic design. A huge achievement on her part, because she was among the, I think she was basically the only art director of her time that was female, that is Cippe Pineles. She was also an Austrian-born designer that had to emigrate to USA. We see this pattern of people that had to flee the Nazis repeating all over again. And from 1942, she was art director of Glamour. From 1947 to 1950, art director of 17, and from 1961, art director of Mademoiselle. She was discovered due to the effort of feminists that insisted that there were graphic designers that were females during that time, only that they were not, so glamorous, and they were not focused on so much. And he created, these are some of her famous designs. What we see here, and what is a little bit more encouraging, is that we see women working finally. And but what we are also seeing here is the development of what Naomi Wolf would call, the beauty myth, and how beauty became a major, blocker for women's development. I mean, you have women working, but they have to be beautiful and elegant, They cannot allow themselves to be, not dressed a certain way and not looking a certain way. Sheila Jeffrey went even further, saying that women go through rituals of submission because they think it is their duty to give men free erections. This is what she says. Okay, so basically,
they had to sell this makeup for legs.
of course. Now, the idea is that if you think, and maybe after we finish, the presentations that are following, basically the history of design as it is presented in Jeremy Anshley's book, we should focus only on, presenting advertisements and posters from this period in comparison to socialist realism. Because I think that the women's portraying in the socialist realism is a little bit more progressive. They are presented in the public sphere. They are not the ones, bimbos that are very nice and very, very well taken care of. They are not looking like this.
They're the exact opposite, actually. They are the exact opposite, because while in the 50s and in the 60s women were behind tractors in Eastern Europe, in America they got this vogue elegance.
Yes, and the idea that you also have to, miracles for women who work, that had to be beautiful at all costs.
Yeah.
Now, an interesting designer, a very interesting one, is Lester Beall. Now, what do I think Jeremy Anshley was right to present him, and let me tell you why. Because all the other designers that I presented that were modernists were not born on American soil. They had to emigrate. Now, he is the one that was American and incorporated basically modernism into his designs. And he became famous once the government hired him to promote some of the politics of Roosevelt, and mainly the New Deal. He had to promote like the campaign for taking electricity to all the villages in the United States. And here, okay, as I often tell students, also this Museum of Modern Art is a resource where you can find portfolios, and it is so good that we live in the digital era, because otherwise they would have had to buy very expensive, books where they could find these designs. Now, one click away and you can see it. So rural electrification administration, now a better home. So he uses these very simple designs to basically promote the New Deal. It was, as I often tell students, it was the thing that got the US out of the crisis that they were experiencing after 1921, and part of the New Deal was huge investments into infrastructure, and he was hired basically by the government to promote this, and this is how he became famous. Now finally somebody from Poland, the country where you reside, because we saw that we didn't have too many designers that were not from Western Europe or from the United States. But we had two exceptions, like the designers from the Czech Republic, and now it is the turn of Henryk Tomaszewski, that was a prolific designer. He was also in a position of power, as we say it today, because he became professor of poster design at the Warsaw Academy, and he worked there for quite a while, from 1952 to 1985, when he retired. And he coordinating from the State Publishing Agency everything that happened in public design. And he was also the head of, how do you say, how is this?
Wydawnictwo artystyczno-graficzne. It means artistic and graphic, but this is like equal positions, artistic and graphic publishing house. And we say that VAG in the abbreviation.
Yeah, so they produce more than 200 posters a year. And at that time, Polish designers rejected social realism. It is not like we were stupid or something in Eastern Europe. It is just that the whole economy was a planned economy, and the idea of competition was absurd, since all the factories were state-owned, and since when you don't have competition, what is it to promote? And of course there were promotions and there were designers, but nothing compared to what happened in the competitive capitalist economy. Nothing compared to that. And I'll have to look it up, because I think you're right to ask about Aro and Dacia, because they were important brands and they still are. Not Aro, but Dacia still is, because it was bought by the French Renault company. But it was nothing of the scale of what happened in the West, basically because there was no need, because you had a market where you had at your disposal Dacia. So there were no products to choose from,
we say
no companies to choose from.
Yeah, but we say that in today's terms, we would say that they were using the whispering marketing. They were using actually the whispering marketing, because when people met, say, they were saying, oh, my Dacia is this and this, and it goes through, and I have this and this problems, and people were talking about their cars. Only that was the only way to promote, like in between people. But I am curious, because I think Dacia was sold also abroad,
Yes,
not only in
was.
Romania. So if it was sold abroad, they had to have some kind of marketing there.
Well, this is something to be investigated, and I think this is very intuitive and interesting, and maybe I'm self-colonized enough not to pay attention to what happened in my own country, but I will take the advice of that professor that asked about Romanian design and your advice and investigate it further, because I don't know about that.
Okay, one last sentence I want to say, but not only Dacia, but for example, did you ever see a poster for Lada or for Zhiguli or
No,
for, I don't know, like the
remember
Polish
lot.
Fiat or the Yugoslavian Zastava or
No.
the German Wartburg? You didn't, right? Maybe there were some kind of brochures or some, I
Yes,
don't know.
yes, you're definitely right, because they had to sell them abroad, and even though maybe it was not advertising targeted to Romanians, maybe it was advertising targeted to foreign publics. So you're absolutely right, and I have to look it up because I don't really know about it.
And now getting back to this Tomaszewski, I would say that in Hollywood films, this type of art was very highly
Appreciated.
appreciated because in some set decorations you can see this Polish art, uh, posters.
Design and
Um, and we actually do have a museum of posters in Warsaw, which is of course interesting. It's a very very high reprisal state policy back then because actually the original posters from Hollywood were not multiplied for the main audience here, but these artists created their own posters expressing the titles in their own way because I don't know if this liberty right now it is impossible because everything is copyrighted, so you
yes,
cannot do
yes.
that anymore.
This is the last designer that I want to talk about today. Because we want to decolonize, isn't it, the history of design, but we are only focusing not on specific designs of that countries, but also on designers that made it, and made it, that were able to gain the attention of the Western audiences. So it's still a very European and a very global north-centered perspective. So we have to recognize and admit this. Yusaku Kamekura, that lived from 1950 to 1997, he was born on April 6. We are now on April 11. He was a leading figure in Japan's design. He was nicknamed the boss because of his stature and of his fame. And he studied from 1935 to 1937 at the Institute of New Architecture and Industrial Arts in Tokyo. And in 1951, he participated in the establishment of Japan Advertising Arts Club, which secured social recognition for the profession of graphic designer. And he created the posters from the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo. So this is how he reached international fame and managed to put Japan on the map of international design. And here, because Graphics, as I always tell students, is a very good magazine that allows you to see the portfolios of designers. So basically you can check it out. There are a lot of images here and that he created. Like Paul Rand, he had a very keen eye for symbols and their use in his posters. And he was internationally acclaimed for his creations.
What? Oh,
So I urge you to go here and check it up because he is the creator of this ones. And I placed in my presentation a link to Graphics magazine where you can find most of his work. And you can study it and get inspired. Okay, so that was basically it for today. I wanted to stress, and my message is that unfortunately, on American soil, all that we learned about modernism in Europe was somehow lost, not in form. The form was maintained and developed and used, but the message, not so much. It was not art for society, not art with a message, not art designed to change society, but it was an art that was aimed to maintain the status quo. I mean, to maintain the power relations, especially between men and women in the society, extremely conservative. And it was also very pragmatic. I mean, it was form used to sell basically goods and to make money, not to change society, you know. So this is it. This is the conclusion of today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it and you find useful information about graphic design, its history, and what happened with modernism during the 50s. Now, the last information that I want to give is that due to the existence of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, this style is called mid-century modern and also New York style, the New York style. And this is basically it. I hope you enjoyed it and you will join us for our next presentation of the history of graphic design.